Rasputin is oft overlooked. A minute private museum has just been opened at his Sprog Drop too, immortalised in luminous media. It is today that we gaze exactly what pondered that immortality. Now, this last falls down when it's considered that this is not a new concept. Now, to look further today, we have to delve back into the newly established form of parliamentary power in Russia in the 18th century, in fact. The newly fledged Duma, or Parliament, was desperately trying to shove the economic grain that industrialization had started in the 1880s. Clashing ideas on leadership fluttered, and no one knew exactly what was going down with the monarchy. Confusion strayed so far across the waters and time. On taking power, Nicholas II tipped his hat to uphold his father's legacy. Alexander III had been a staunch conservative, an autocrat, plugging the idea of keeping the old rule. He had firmly made economic reform, specifically to drop up the autocracy. Many believed that the constitutional form of monarchy was the thing. A divided house is a social construct that reeks of organic deconstructionalization. Although peasants were expressly loyal to their Tsar, even at the point of absurdity. Though they did want land reform on the table, it would give them more independence and less state finger. The working classes were multiplying quickly, and socialist propaganda springing with them. There was also the intelligentsia, whose nom de plume was the Bolsheviks. They were the main plotters, and would not have been so successful if it weren't for the working classes. For intelligentsia, read working class. In 1894, Nicholas made himself comfortable on the throne and simultaneously got hitched to Princess Alex of the House Dumastate. Although English, she popped the name of Alexandria to fit in with the crowd, so to speak. Orthodox Church and all that. Marxist revolutionaries were on the prowl after Nicholas's father whooped the economy, and peasants were discontented and poised to revolt. Revolting peasants. Students were the main prob too, as usual. As a consequence of the partying revolt, Nick was given the pseudonym Nicholas the Bloody. The Tsar lived with a member of a father who despised him and was a bally bully. Really, honestly. Nick had no plate for confrontation at all. Then, 1905, brought war with China for the trading territory, the Trans-Siberian Railway in particular. The Russian fleet was sunk in Tuzama. In August, a peace treaty was thrashed. This left a piece of the gov that was picked up, and the Duma stepped up. This is where we're heading, it's asked. But even Leon Trotsky considered this. Just a bit of paper. He said, "Today they give it to you, tomorrow they tear it into bits. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Partygate." The Duma was elected with conservative stooges willing to suck the Tsar's toes, so by November it was apparent that Nick had no thought of letting it get in the way of his God-given right to rule.
Get down on your knees.
Remember that one? That God-given mentality does the round during this period in history. They couldn't get a son, but they had 3 daughters. By 1901, they decided to go to a faith healer in France to get that baby. His wife's sister-in-law, Grand Duchess Nikita, recommended Philip Niza-Vichgood. He was later sent packing back to France when he got it wrong. In 1904, though, she had Alexei, the Tsarish. When it was found he was a haemophiliac, they had little choice but to throw hands down. Medicine was a nipper, and those who survived had a very hard 50, bleeding out or worse when they got the slightest nick. Thusly, in exasperation of political and personal strife, the Rom family landed themselves with a peasant from Siberia. Born in a small village called Povokstowe in Siberia, Rasputin was born on the 10th of January 1869. named Rasputnik. Some said it was his adept nature of spiritual understanding which gave him the ability to become what we call today a horse whisperer, even a ghost whisperer. He was banned from the church, and his lecherous yearnings knew no bounds, especially with his empathic prowess. There were wandering holy men that came from the monastery in Blighty, and he learned a lot from them. It was pondered in the brain box of Freud that it is a universal obsessional neurosis. Was Greg neurotic, perhaps? Neurologically obsessed with beauty? One ledge has it that when he was lashed as a boy for horse stealing, he collapsed into a fit of mysticism. He began to exhibit his special powers from then on, and visit more and more god gaffs, all visiting on fanaticism. He would sit by the roadside and plug his new trade, a sure sign from an early age that he had a slightly autistic tendencies, preferring his own company other than that of Sosh for a start. He started visiting the monastery more and more frequently, and when he learned from his first 2-week visit, he was a changed man. He started talking in youngest, and went wild, a wild Grushenka, Gregory. He married Pashkranova in 1888, and she was level-headed, the most stable diamond in Rasputin's life, providing him with 2 daughters and 2 sons. Their firstborn died 6 months. She was very patient with him and his dalliances with the fillies. It was thought that Gregory belonged to the Kahisti sect, and that they had such similar oaths, it was almost inevitable. Basically, because Christ was born through intercourse, it is their noggin said that all cannot be redeemed without copious intercourse. Flagellation, dancing, drinking, erotic nights were all part of the belief drink. By 1906, Greg was known mainly as a healer rather than a priest. He never referred to himself like that. It was in Kiev in 1905. Now, Kiev, of course, today is a country of great contention. I think I've done a video on this as well. I should have linked this in the description box. But our war with Kiev is a great contention. And this is the foundations of perhaps where it started. It all started with the foundations of this kind of political ramifications going on. Now, as I was saying, it was in Kiev in 1905 that he was introduced to the Grand Duchess Anastasia, the wife of the Tsar's cousin. It was upon this recommendation that he was persuaded to go to St. Petersburg. His reputation was rapidly superseding him in the early years of the 20th century. That was something. Kiev had the upper hand. It's good to know that Kiev had the upper hand at one point in history, at least. They introduced Russia to Greg. Now, Anna Vaivompriva was the Tsarina's confidant, who had already been touched by Greg's islets in relation to her failed marriage. Anna was irreplaceable to the Tsarina, as Greg was to become. Alexander was balmy about the possibility of the Tsar's family interfering in his reign and trying to usurp him, paranoia rearing its ugly head in court again. As a result, Greg's whisper that believe in the power of my prayer was easily attractive to her. She persuaded herself that her son's life was in Greg's hands. To her, Greg was a starets, a guru, and a seer. For frequenting public bathhouses to preach he also used his apartments that were furnished by Linda as a preaching venue. People were waiting 2 or 3 days to see him, clamouring down the streets as perhaps some might do today for the latest movie showing. And mostly there were young women. He claimed that they had more sins to expiate. he charged no fee, but his secretary, Staroperechev, who was being watched by the police as he charged at least 100 rubles on the side, apparently to build a church in Povokstowe. Greg kept the Tsarina a secret, as his visits to her became more a mystique to the public and his status grew higher. When the Tsar was informed of Greg's activities, though, he was advised to cut off contact, suggesting he should go home for a break. Backbone scarcely seen in historical monarchy, although this was more out of concern than avoidance. When this happened, Greg would board the Trans-Siberian Express, taking a dozen women as their disciples with him. People liked to fight over institutions like the trains, but had no problem in using them, thus compounding the problem. Most of the time, women threw themselves at him for the case and their own advantage, and sometimes men even offered their wives or lovers up to him. He created a network of influence which reached even after the revolution. The Duma investigation came to the conclusion that Greg's network was a substantial part of why they fell. Now, in 1910, he persuaded his girls and a servant to go and settle in the city with him, as the schools were better. What did them actually like, and did they have teacher strikes? Sensibly, his wife didn't want to go. He was a strict and possessive father, and defo didn't like it when it came to suitors. None of them, his daughter Maria said, had the right to more than half an hour's tete-a-tete, after which father would storm in and throw them out the door. Maria did not gaze on the lecherous Muzak, but saw him as a simple, soothing father. Right-wing bigwigs in the politics of the revolution was not Greg's bag. A staunch lefty activist he was, even after the peasants considered that the Tsar had gone cap in hand to the Jewish bankers. Although he supported the aristos, he was also a free thinker and alighted hists with no one. He often argued for learning reform, and the bourgeoisie had held it back from the people. He was in love about this and almost everything else. Instead of organising pogroms and blaming Jews for every evil, we should be criticising ourselves, he would say. This was not the ideal proto-fascist opinion to be held. The Tsar was always in two minds about creating a new parliament, the Duma, and was afraid to give them decent powers for change. Scottish Assembly, anybody? And in 1910 there was widespread belief that Greg had become the centre of a conspiracy, that he was pushing his own political targets. The Bloc, or Rasputin circle, was suspected mainly because of the shady characters that constantly surrounded him. So Greg went on his second pilgrimage to Jerusalem. An empress stayed in touch via letters which were delivered by the court courier, Baron. Some were stolen by Father Elilidor, and they were proved to be compromising later on. They were from the empress and taken out of historical context, could be seen as very salacious. She said, "My much loved, never to be forgotten teacher," he wrote, "I am so wretched without you, my soul near me. I kiss your hands and lay my head upon your blessed shoulders. I feel so. Where are you? Where have you run off to? Come back soon. I wait and yearn for you. I ask for your holy blessing and kiss your blessed hands. Your eternally loving Mama." Now, let's be clear here. Let's get it into context. She was actually speaking from a more religious and devotional point of view. She was devoted to Greg. She really was. And Mama was their pet name together. So everything she said was less of a sort of like a sexual thing. We get sexual vibes from virtually everything. You have to look at this as a kind of devotion, religious luminosity that surrounded them both and bound them together. It wasn't a salacious scandal as might be seen today, but it was in 1912 that Father Ilador had copied and distributed the letters that had been stolen when in Greg's village. Remember the letters? Yeah. I said they crop up again. On the advice of the PR minister to leave St. Petersburg, Greg did so. His contemporaries thought that he had risen too high above himself, and whilst he was away, Alexander Grishikov, a noble industrialist, had opened a new debate on Greg in the Duma. Now the Tsar insisted it was a family matter that needed Greg's attention, and he could allow no outside interference. Since politicians Grishkov and Rodzinkano were attacking Greg, the Tsar and the Tsarina took it that they were attacking them in their persons. Such was their affection for the priest. Rod was very much inspired by the idea of Greg-based conspiracy, and such an opinion was only bolstered by the fact that Greg had been recalled from Povokstowe to go with the royal family on a diplomatic trip to the Crimea. Now, although Greg skipped off the train as it pulled out of St. Petersburg, thinking it safer for those around him, perhaps a strategy Dominic Cummings might have considered? He arrived at Yalta 3 days late. What was he doing in the intervening time is anybody's guess. The police didn't enjoy his presence, and Greg had to go back to his village. When, in November, the family took a break in their villa in Poland, the Tsarish, he injured himself badly. It was bad, and he was even given the last rites. Now, in desperation, they sent a telegram to Greg, who, after kneeling before an idol for half an hour, sent a telegram back declaring all would be well and it wasn't serious. In June 1914, an elaborate plot to kill Greg almost succeeded. By coincidence, or was it? It was the very day that Archduke Ferdinand was popped at Sarajevo. Now, how history hits alignment sometimes is quite astounding. The assassin attempt was a ploy orchestrated by Father Ilador, using a lady of the night of Greg's acquaintance. Greg was patched up without anaesthetic and taken to Tiananmen. The prophet was released due to psychic agitation a year earlier. Greg had urged the Tsar to keep the peace in the Balkans, and now war had kicked off. He pointed out that the Ottoman Turks had a better record for religious tolerance than Orthodox Christians. Now, the PR advocated it by saying that war would only contribute to serve political power and hilltop haranguing. Despite Greg's protestations, Nick did not wish to be seen as weak. Greg prophesied a terrible storm hangs over Russia. Disaster, grief, murky darkness and light, whole oceans of tears and so much blood. But as he went home again, he began to fish for focus of his powers, finding the only release for realization of old age was to go on copious drinking bouts. Now, we've all been there. Brawls were frequently on the streets, and he became a burden to the boys in blue. His scandalous behaviour reared its peak in Petrograd. Now, this was St. Peter's renamed in 1914. It was, though, in Moscow that things really hit the fan in 1915. And he went to Moscow to reposition his image, a sort of campaign tour. Now, there could have been a grassy knoll there, but there wasn't. It all got out of hand when, accompanied by a set of young journalists and several young women, Greg visited a night spot and got tight as an owl. cavorting with a gypsy band, he spent the evening boasting about his intimate relationship with the Empress and saying things like, "I can make her dance if I wanted to." He proceeded to flash the room, dropping his breeches and waving it about. Now, John Barrowman would have been so proud. Nikolai Malakov, the Interior Minister, was delighted at Greg's disgrace and jotted that it would bring the Tsarina to her senses. But it was not until June that Nick was informed fully of the saucy details. Greg's duties were more courtier-based than white-collar church work now, and the Duma deputies were always on Nick about appointing deputies and such, like to lassie with instead of Greg all the time. The Tsar thought it should work harder to see things his way. The Empress still didn't want to share power, and between 1915 and 1917 there were 4 PR ministers to this effect. Inflation was rampant by 1916, and the Empress was commonly being called the German woman, as a reproach for ruling failures. People loved a good jerry bashing. It was commonly felt that Russia was being run by fools, and that they were destroying the future and progress. Stock in the Romanovs plunged drastically, especially when even this occurred, and even Greg publicly agreed.
Are you waiters or Englishmen?
Prince Felix Yusupov was the baby blue of one of Russia's richest families and married to Tsarina's niece. Now, in December 1916, he tried to bump off Greg. Princess Elena was the link to the royal family, making it unfortunate that homosexuality was a serious crime, punishable by exile, and that was a light sentence. Though as a member of the aristocracy, a blind eye was often turned, and the German woman was being manipulated by the holy devil, it was thought. It might have been that the pussy was simply attracted to Greg. Seems touchy, though. Vladimir Putrevich, though, and Dr. Stanislav Litovert joined in a plot to depose of Greg. They also got involved the Grand Duke, Dmitry Pavlovich, Pussy's one-time love, who deserted him. They were all firmly of the belief that Greg was feeding Nick happy snappers to keep him in a state of wide-eyed. The 4th conspirator was a lieutenant called Ivan Sukhoin, a contact inside the military, of course. At first they were unaware of how to proceed. Perhaps the body should be found at the point of assassination, or perhaps it should be lost. Pussy decided to invite Greg to shake appendages with his wife, as he was visiting Greg's apartment a lot, and he thought it would be a nice segue that Pussy could give him cakes laced with cyanide. He insinuated that if he was to be killed by peasants, then the Tsar's children would live and reign for 100 years. Though if he was murdered by nobles, then none of the children would remain alive much more than 2 years, and that they would be killed by the Russian people. He ate the cakes, and then had some Madeira wine, poisoned as well, of course. Nothing happened. Greg simply gurgled in his tum. It was 2 o'clock, and Greg was getting sus and wondering why the Empress had not appeared by this time. Puss left the room with the excuse that he would go and find his wife. The others told Puss to go back and to wait until the poison had done the trick. But if it had not in 5, then he should return. But Greg was revived by a simple cuppa in the end, and listened to Puss play the guitar for an hour. In desperation, Puss then got the Grand Duke's revolver and watched as Greg drank some more wine. He then suggested they should go to the Jippos for more entertainment, when he had revived his spirits, and even a crucifix was brandished in front of Greg in a desperate attempt to suppose the priest's demonic powers. Pussy provocatively went down on one knee and whispered in Greg's shell-like that he should say a prayer. And he then remorselessly shot Greg in the chest. Now, at 3, Greg was pronounced dead by the dock, and they all went down upstairs to burn Greg's clothes. Pussy stayed at the body's side and contentedly smoked a cigar. He then grabbed and shook the body in anger and annoyance, and Greg awoke in a state of seizure, giving the prince a diabolical look of hatred and contempt. He attacked poor old Pussy, foaming at the mouth. Greg shouted, "I'll tell Zardina! You're all dead!" They all shot him 4 times then. And spent 10 minutes kicking him violently until he no longer moved. They then told the guards on the gate, and the guards dutifully swore to tell no one for the sake of the country. They then took the body out of the house and shot 2 bullets in the air, deliberately alerting a policeman. Taking the corpse back into the house, they then proceeded to kick the head until beaten black and blue. Pussy felt a pathological sexual urge at the point and vomited on the victim and covered himself with blood. He was then taken away to recover himself, wrapped in a curtain and tied up as they dropped the body into a canal. Greg had found that he had forgot to tie the weights to it, and one of the boots was left on the deck. Everyone knew who had murdered Greg. The peelers, as predicted, let slit them. No, Posthumous, where the Bolshevik revolutionaries gathered them together in one place and shot them. The whole Romanov royalists decimated in a small confined basement of a local farmer. The drama that their daughter Anastasia survived might be a talent. It might be a talent for another time. When all is said and done, old Greg the pervy preacher was a devout man. Western culture, however, would find him unorthodox in his devotions, but he was a holy soul. He solidified the brain matter so much that the devotion could be said to be beauty, even as in the appalling age of culture clashes and riots of raucous thought. That side of persona was evident even to a blind man. But he explains change and psychological deviance to such a degree it is a wonder more modern thought isn't to take a lesson from it. He was not a hero of youth, nor a village of old school ties, but a saviour and a prophet of his faith. None of us can aspire to be any better than that. Give us a good clicking.
Shakanaka.